I'm Jamie, 34, and until last Friday, I was technically employed at Harrison Technologies, the manufacturing company my late father-in-law, Richard, started 40 years ago. I say technically because nobody there ever really took my job seriously. To the board of directors, I was just another trust fund girl who married the boss's son. The daughter-in-law with no real job, the woman who wandered around with a laptop and an access badge, taking up oxygen and payroll. I've heard them call me that. Sometimes whispered in hallways, sometimes half-joked over cocktails. They saw me as the decoration, the tag-along wife, the girl who got a desk because her last name was convenient. They had no idea I was the one holding the detonator. Last Friday at 9:30 a.m., David Sterling's assistant emailed me with the warmth of a parking ticket, ordering me to report to conference room A. No explanation, no agenda. Just that clipped, controlled tone corporate people use when they already decided your fate. Conference room A is the big one. Floor-to-ceiling windows over downtown Chicago, obscene mahogany table, chairs that cost more than most people's rent. It's where they decide who gets promoted, who gets demoted, and which departments get quietly erased. When I walked in, 6 board members were already waiting for me. David sat at the head of the table like a king who'd ruled too long. To his right was Kevin Parker, all slick hair and wet cardboard personality, gripping his pen like he was about to sign my life away. Patricia, the CFO, stared at her hands. The others looked everywhere but at me. Jamie, David began, saying my name the way people talk to a houseplant they forgot to water. He launched into a speech about restructuring, realigning resources, and optimizing operational efficiency. I've learned that when men in suits start stacking buzzwords like that, what they really mean is, we've decided you're disposable. Kevin cut in, unable to hide his pleasure. We're terminating your position, effective immediately, he said, with that little smile he gets when he thinks he's being clever. Of course, this isn't personal, it's just business. They waited for me to break. They expected tears, begging, maybe anger. Something that would confirm their story, that I was emotional, unstable, the founder's silly daughter-in-law who couldn't handle the real world. Instead, I smiled. That's perfect, I said softly, straightening my blazer. I was starting to worry about how awkward it would be to fire you all while still on payroll. Kevin blinked. I'm sorry, what? I placed my leather folder on the table, the one I'd taken from the biometric safe behind the abstract painting in my home office. The one Richard helped me install while his son, my husband Samuel, was in Milan, pretending that networking meant posting photos from rooftop bars. On the front of the folder, in clean black print, was a single line. Transfer of controlling interest. Harrison Technologies, Inc. 71%. My 71%. The room went silent. Not the normal office quiet, but that heavy, suffocating silence where everyone suddenly understands they are not in control. They fired me on Friday morning. By Monday, they were going to learn what it meant to fire the woman who actually owned the company. Let me back up. I met Samuel, Richard's son, 7 years ago. Back then, I wasn't the boss's daughter-in-law or the woman taking up space at Harrison Technologies. I was just Jamie Parker, a 27-year-old with a fresh degree from Northwestern, a brain wired for numbers, and a chronic case of imposter syndrome. Samuel and I met at a charity gala downtown, the kind with silent auctions, crystal chandeliers, and people pretending to care about the nonprofit more than the open bar. I was there because my friend scored extra tickets. Samuel was there because his last name was Harrison. I remember seeing him across the room, laughing too loudly at some joke a board member made. Perfect suit, perfect teeth, perfect smile. The kind of man who knew how to work a room without ever doing any actual work. He found me near the bar, frowning at the wine list. You look like you're trying to calculate the ROI on a glass of Merlot, he said, amused. I snorted. I'm trying to figure out why this one costs more than my car payment. He smiled like he'd discovered a new toy. I'm Samuel. I know, I said before I could stop myself. Your face is on half the family business articles on LinkedIn. He laughed, like that was the best thing anyone had said all night. That was Samuel. Charming, bright on the surface, occasionally deep when it didn't require too much effort. What I didn't expect was his father. I met Richard the second time Samuel took me to the Harrison house. It wasn't really a house. It was a 3-story brick monument to, I built this from nothing, complete with a private study that smelled like leather, old books, and very expensive whiskey. Richard shook my hand, his grip firm but warm. "So," he said, studying me over his glasses, "you're the woman my son has mentioned 5 times in the last week." "Dad," Samuel groaned, "please don't interrogate her." "I'm not interrogating," Richard said. "I'm evaluating. There's a difference." He asked me where I went to school, what I studied, what I thought about manufacturing in the age of AI, and why most MBAs didn't understand the difference between a balance sheet and a mood board. I answered as best I could, sweating through my blouse, hyper-aware of every word. Halfway through, he sat back, eyes narrowing with what I later recognized as approval. "You actually understand numbers," he said slowly, "not just the parts you can turn into inspirational slides." Samuel rolled his eyes. "Dad, please don't adopt my girlfriend as your second CFO." Richard didn't adopt me as his second CFO. He did something worse. He adopted me as a student. Over the next few years, his study became our unofficial war room. We'd sit there at midnight, with factory reports spread across his desk, drinking scotch I pretended to enjoy, while he walked me through the company from the ground up. "This," he'd say, tapping a spreadsheet, "is what matters. Not the press releases, not the glossy brochures, not whatever nonsense David says at the shareholder meetings. This, cash flow, inventory, head count, real things." I learned how the factories smelled at 5 a.m. when the first shifts clocked in. I learned the names of line supervisors who'd been there longer than most of the board. I learned how a small delay in parts arriving in Ohio could ripple all the way to a missed contract in Germany. To everyone else, I was Samuel's girlfriend, then Samuel's wife. To Richard, I was the one person in the family who actually gave a damn about the company itself, not just the image. 3 years ago, Samuel and I got married. The wedding was beautiful in that curated, Instagrammable way that made Samuel's influencer friends very happy. White flowers, rooftop photos, a hashtag I hated but tolerated. Somewhere during the reception, one of the board members clinked his glass and called me the luckiest woman alive. He wasn't talking about Samuel. He was talking about my proximity to Harrison Money. After the honeymoon, I joined the company in what HR called an analyst role. No clear responsibilities, no real authority. It was a job made of air, a title to justify my badge. The board loved it that way. Behind my back, they called me furniture. I know, because one afternoon I walked into the break room and heard Kevin laughing with another director. "She's harmless," he said. "Just background, like the potted plants." He froze when he saw me. I smiled like I hadn't heard a thing, stirred my coffee, and made a mental note. Another name for the list. 6 months ago, everything shifted. Richard was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't come with percentages or timelines, just a quiet, heavy look from the doctor that tells you everything. For a while, Samuel spiraled into denial, throwing himself into parties and trips and brand partnerships. The board moved like sharks scenting blood in the water. And Richard? Richard called me into his study. "Sit," he said, voice rougher than usual. He poured 2 glasses of his favorite whiskey, slid a thick folder across the desk, and looked me dead in the eye. "Doctors are giving me a month, maybe 2, he said. "I'll be damned if I let those parasites tear apart everything I built." Inside the folder were share transfer documents. Not to Samuel, to me. 71% controlling interest in Harrison Technologies. "Why me?" I whispered, my throat tight. "Because you actually see the company," Richard replied, "not the photo ops." He made me promise to keep it secret, especially from Samuel. He'd once said his daughter loved the image of power. In my life, it was Samuel. Samuel cared about aesthetics, brand deals, headlines. He thought leadership was about being photographed in the right light. Richard knew that wouldn't save Harrison. So 3 weeks before he died, we signed everything. In his lawyer's office, with my attorney, Jennifer Chen, sitting beside me. A notary named Gladys witnessing the whole thing, probably unaware she was stamping a corporate nuclear bomb into existence. Richard even finished an expert-level Sudoku in under 8 minutes that day, just to have extra evidence of his mental competence. "The lawyers like proof," he'd said dryly. "Might as well give them something entertaining." By the time he died, the plan was set. The board thought they were circling a wounded animal. They never realized the quiet daughter-in-law in the background was the one he'd chosen to carry the knife. After Richard's death, everything began unraveling, but not in the way the board expected. They weren't afraid of me. They weren't even paying attention. To them, I was still the same harmless accessory Samuel had married, the woman who sat quietly in meetings, the the woman they assumed didn't understand EBITDA or operational efficiency, the woman they believed Richard had merely tolerated because she made Samuel happy. If only they knew. Richard's funeral was 3 weeks ago. It was a spectacle drenched in black silk, corporate hypocrisy, and crocodile tears. A full orchestra played as if he were a monarch, not a man who hated pretension and preferred barbecue over banquets. The board sat in the front row like grieving angels, even though half of them hadn't visited him once when he was sick. Samuel stood beside me, adjusting his designer sunglasses even though we were indoors. He squeezed my hand occasionally, but his mind was elsewhere, on how many reporters were photographing the event, on which influencers were attending, on how he looked in his tailored black suit. Meanwhile, the board watched him like they were waiting for him to transform into their new puppet. And me? I stood invisible, a prop, a decorative widow-in-law. Someone behind me whispered, "Why is she even here? She didn't do anything at Harrison." I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. Invisible was good. Invisible meant underestimated. Invisible meant safe, at least until the moment I struck. After the funeral, Samuel insisted on hosting what he called a coronation party. I corrected him, appointment celebration, but he liked the sound of coronation. A passing of the torch he assumed was meant for him. The penthouse ballroom glowed with chandeliers and pretension. There were ice sculptures shaped like the company logo, a champagne fountain, a string quartet that no one listened to because everyone was too busy networking. I watched the board surround Samuel as if he were the second coming of Richard. David Sterling, the silver-haired, self-proclaimed visionary, raised a glass. "To Samuel," he declared, with false reverence, "the future of Harrison Technologies." A few people clapped. Others whispered predictions. Not one of them looked at me. Perfect. Then Kevin Parker, snide, opportunistic, and perpetually overconfident, wandered over with a martini in hand. "You holding up okay, Jamie?" he asked in a tone reserved for consolation prizes. "Must be quite the adjustment, from being married to the CEO's son to whatever your role is now." He smiled like he'd delivered a clever blow. I returned his smile. "Oh, it's exhausting. Breathing and collecting dividends sometimes feels like a full-time job." He laughed, clinking his glass. He didn't understand I wasn't joking. Over the next weeks, subtle signs appeared, little things most people would dismiss, but I'd learned enough from Richard to recognize a shift when I saw one. Meetings were suddenly held without me. Emails concerning key decisions conveniently forgot to include my address. Board members smiled at me the way people smile at children holding plastic tools. Samuel grew more enamored with the idea of being the face of the company than with actually running it. At dinner one night, he said, "David thinks I should revamp the entire leadership image. Maybe a new logo, new color scheme, something bold. Or," I suggested, "you could learn the manufacturing numbers first." He blinked. "Is that necessary? I'll hire people for that." I set my fork down. "Samuel, running a company isn't a photo shoot." He scoffed lightly. "You sound like my dad." "Maybe because he built it," I replied. He pushed away from the table. "You take all this too seriously." No, I took Richard seriously. Samuel took himself seriously. Those were very different things. One morning, I overheard 2 board members whispering outside the elevator. "She's harmless," one said. "She won't make trouble," the other replied. "She never has." I stepped into the elevator behind them. They fell silent. Only Patricia, the CFO, ever met my eyes for longer than a second. Sometimes I caught something like understanding there, or hesitation. Maybe she sensed the storm brewing, or maybe she simply paid attention. Either way, I filed her expression away. Richard once told me, "People reveal who they are when they think no one is looking, and they reveal even more when they think you can't touch them." The board thought they were untouchable. They believed Samuel was their golden boy, and I, just the decorative wife, the background noise, the potted plant with a salary. They had no idea that the real threat wasn't Samuel. It was the quiet woman behind him holding 71% of the company. The Friday they fired me began like any other corporate morning. Stale coffee, stiff suits, and the quiet hum of people pretending they weren't counting down to the weekend. I was in my small, windowless office, a space they'd assigned me because all analysts start here. Never mind that half the analysts were on the 14th floor with panoramic views and ergonomic chairs. Mine had a flickering light and a thermostat that alternated between Arctic death and surface of the sun. At 9:30 a.m. sharp, an email arrived. From Assistant to Chairman Sterling. Subject: immediate attendance required. Location: conference room. The email tone was precise, cold, and unmistakably rehearsed. Corporate execution without the courtesy of a heads up. Still, I smoothed my blouse, adjusted the burgundy necklace Richard had once gifted me, and walked toward the boardroom like a woman heading to her own trial. Conference room. A loomed large, polished marble floors, glass walls, a table long enough to host a small royal banquet. The skyline glittered behind them, Chicago stretching endlessly outward. 6 board members sat waiting. David Sterling at the head, smug in his charcoal suit. Kevin Parker to his right, vibrating with anticipation. 3 middle-tier directors who never spoke unless spoken to. And Patricia, the CFO, seated stiffly, eyes fixed on the table. When I entered, they went silent. The kind of silence that confirms your suspicion. Oh, they're not reviewing anything. They're ambushing me. Jamie, David began, folding his hands together like a man posing for a magazine profile. Please have a seat. I sat. He exhaled dramatically. After reviewing current organizational structure, we've determined some adjustments must be made for efficiency and long-term strategic alignment. Corporate poetry for we've decided you're disposable. Kevin leaned forward, practically gleeful. We're terminating your position, he said, savoring every syllable. Effective immediately. Of course, this isn't personal. It's simply business. His eyes shone. He'd been waiting to say this. Practicing it, probably, in the mirror while fixing his hair. They expected me to crumble. Samuel certainly would have. He cried when a barista spelled his name wrong. But I simply folded my hands in my lap and studied their faces, one by one. David, self-satisfied. Kevin, hungry for humiliation. Patricia, conflicted. The others, uncomfortable but compliant. They expected begging, tears, shock, a meltdown to justify their narrative. Instead, I smiled politely. Well, I said, that's a relief. I was worried you might try to make this awkward. Kevin blinked. Relief? Of course, I replied calmly. It would have been much messier if I'd had to fire you all while still technically on payroll. Silence. A stunned electric silence. David frowned deeply. I'm not sure I understand. Oh, I'm sure you will. I placed my leather folder on the table. I brought something that might help clarify the situation. Kevin scoffed. Unless that folder contains a miracle, I don't think... It contains ownership, I said softly. His mouth snapped shut. I slid the folder toward the center of the table. The gold-embossed title glinted under the recessed lighting. Transfer of controlling interest. Harrison Technologies, Inc., 71%. For a moment, no one breathed. David's lips parted slightly, as though he were reading a foreign language. One director leaned so far forward he nearly fell out of his chair. Patricia sat perfectly still, hands tightening around her pen. But Kevin? Watching Kevin's face was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. He reached for the document with a trembling hand, flipping pages. His confidence evaporated, his complexion drained. This must be a mistake, he stammered. Richard would never, he couldn't have meant, this isn't valid. You didn't even have a real job. I raised a single finger. Correction. You fired me, so the couldn't hold a job narrative is technically your fault, not mine, he sputtered. But the timing, 3 weeks before he died, surely he wasn't mentally competent? I finished for him. We thought you might say that, which is why we notarized the transfer, had both attorneys present, recorded witness testimony, and completed a medically verified mental competency assessment. Kevin froze. And, I added, in case that wasn't enough, Richard solved an expert-level Sudoku puzzle in under 8 minutes that day. Jennifer framed it. Would you like to see? Patricia choked on air. One director coughed violently. Even David's jaw twitched. This destabilizes everything, David finally whispered. Shareholders, investors, confidence. David, I said gently, the only destabilizing force in this company has been you. A sharp inhale spread through the room. Patricia's eyes flicked toward me. Not shocked, not horrified, but relieved. I stood, smoothing my blazer. You fired the wrong woman, I said quietly. And by Monday, you'll feel the consequences. I left the room with 6 stunned men and 1 silent woman behind me. And for the first time in months, I felt Richard beside me. Not in grief, in victory. When I stepped out of the boardroom, the hallway felt too bright, too quiet, like the world hadn't yet realized something irreversible had just happened. I walked past the glass panels, past the interns pretending to look busy, past the executives who'd long stopped acknowledging my existence. My heart was steady, my breath even, but inside there was a whirlpool of emotions I couldn't yet name. Shock, relief, aching grief for Richard, a deep, simmering fury for how easily they tried to erase me, and underneath it all, a rising current of power I wasn't used to feeling. I had known this moment was coming. Richard had prepared me. But knowing something intellectually and standing in it, those were very different things. When the elevator doors slid shut behind me, that was when the trembling started. My hands shook first, then my breath hitched, my throat tightened. Not because of fear, because for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't pretending. By the time I got home, Samuel still hadn't called. I found him sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through social media with the seriousness of a surgeon reviewing MRI scans. "Hey," I said quietly, dropping my keys. He glanced up, then immediately back at his phone. "Hey, did you pick up almond milk?" I stared at him. "I got fired today, Samuel." He paused, thumb still hovering above the screen. "Yeah, I heard," he said flatly. "People are talking. Kind of embarrassing." Embarrassing, not for me, for him. Because in his mind, everything reflected back on him. I lowered myself into the armchair across from him, every muscle tight. "Embarrassing?" I repeated slowly. "I got fired from a role they never took seriously. That bothers you?" He shrugged, scrolling again. "It's just not great optics. People think you're emotional, maybe unstable." I inhaled sharply. "Samuel, they ambushed me, in a boardroom, without warning. Do you really think—" "Jamie," he sighed, finally setting his phone down. "I don't want to fight. I'm just saying you could have handled it better." "Handled getting fired better?" I asked, my voice trembling between pain and disbelief. "You know how gossip works," he replied. "And people are saying—" My voice cracked. "What are people saying?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. That you were never really qualified. That maybe hiring you was nepotism and— "Jamie, don't look at me like that. I'm just telling you what they're saying." "Do you believe them?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Silence. The most honest answer of all. That night, after Samuel left for drinks with friends, I walked into my home office and stared at the painting that hid the safe. A swirl of expensive abstract nonsense he bought at a charity gala. This was the moment Richard had prepared me for. I lifted the frame, pressed my thumb to the biometric pad, and the safe clicked open with a soft, mechanical sigh. Inside lay the document. Heavy paper, official seals, Richard's signature, bold, steady, unmistakably lucid. 71% of Harrison Technologies. I held it carefully, like it was a newborn or a bomb. In a way, it was both. The weight of it in my hands was a physical reminder. They fired me from a job I technically didn't need because I already owned the company. For months, I'd been walking through those hallways invisible, underestimated, dismissed, humiliated. And they had no idea. I took a photo of the document and texted it to Jennifer Chen with one sentence. "How strong is our position now that they've fired me?" Her reply came less than 30 seconds later. Ironclad. 3 legal teams reviewed it. Let them dig their own grave. Timing is hilarious. Congratulations. I let the phone drop onto the desk and covered my face with both hands. Not crying, breathing, just breathing. Because the truth was sinking in. Richard hadn't simply given me shares. He had chosen me, over Samuel, over the board, over the entire corporate machine. He trusted me to carry the legacy he built from nothing. And in that moment, the shock began to harden into something sharper. Resolve. Monday would come, and when it did, they would learn what it felt like to underestimate a woman who knew the business better than they ever did. But that night, alone in the dim light of my office, I whispered into the quiet, "I won't let you down, Richard." For the first time in my life, the fear wasn't of failing them. It was of failing him. Tomorrow I would begin the fight. Tonight, I allowed myself one last quiet moment with grief, with anger, with the memory of the man who believed I was capable of more than anyone else ever had. And for the first time since he died, I believed him. Monday morning hit like a spotlight, a bright, unforgiving spotlight, exposing every whisper, every lie, every underestimation that had circled me for years. And for the first time, I wasn't stepping into Harrison Technologies as Samuel's wife, or the board's decorative analyst, or the quiet girl in the background who knew just enough to be harmless. I was walking in as the majority owner. But the building didn't know that yet. I wore my navy suit, The one Richard once said made me look like I understood more than everyone else in the room, but was polite enough not to say it out loud. The burgundy necklace rested against my collarbone like a talisman. When I stepped through the revolving doors, security stopped me immediately. Not Dave, the warm, middle-aged security guard who always asked about my lunch and told me about his kids' soccer games. Today it was Marcus, 6'4", linebacker shoulders, and the emotional subtlety of a cinder block. "Mrs. Harrison," he said stiffly, "you've been flagged by HR. I need to call someone." Flagged, like I was a threat. Good, maybe I was. Janet from HR appeared moments later, clutching her tablet like it was a shield she wasn't trained to use. She couldn't meet my eyes. "Jamie, please follow me," she said. "This is highly irregular." "I imagine it is," I replied calmly. "Not every day you escort a majority shareholder." She blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Never mind," I smiled. "You'll understand soon." We rode the elevator in silence, but I was humming, the theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Richard would have appreciated the drama. When the boardroom doors opened, quiet conversations halted mid-sentence. David's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Kevin nearly inhaled his pastry. One director whispered, "Oh God," under his breath. "Good morning," I said brightly. "Lovely day, isn't it?" They stared at me the way people stare at a fire in their living room. Shocked, helpless, and faintly aware they should do something, but no idea what. David cleared his throat. "Jamie, you don't work here anymore." "I know," I said. "Strange, right? Firing someone who owns the company." Kevin flinched. This was going to be delicious. I took my seat, Richard's seat, at the head of the table and set my leather folder down with a satisfying thunk. "I think we should talk." Patricia, sitting 2 seats down, exhaled so softly I barely heard it. Relief. She knew. Maybe not the details, but she'd sensed the shift. Kevin burst first. "You can't just walk in here," he snapped. "This is highly inappropriate." "Oh, Kevin," I cut in gently. "Inappropriate was you firing me before understanding the ownership structure of the company you pretend to manage." He went silent. I opened the folder and slid the documents into the center of the table again, the dreaded 71%. "This is impossible," David whispered hoarsely. "Richard would never—" "Richard picked the person who understood the business," I interrupted, "not the person who understood how to pose for Forbes." Samuel wasn't in the room. He rarely attended operations meetings, but I felt his shadow all the same. He wanted the crown, but he never wanted to earn it. David's jaw worked like he was chewing broken glass. "You don't have the experience." "Oh?" I leaned forward. "Neither does Samuel. But that didn't stop all of you from treating him like the second coming of Steve Jobs." Silence. "You fired me on Friday," I said. "Today, we'll discuss why none of you are qualified to fire anyone." That's when my phone buzzed, loudly, on the polished table. I glanced at the screen. Victoria Martinez, Anderson Holdings, our largest external investor. Perfect timing. I answered and put the call on speaker. "Ms. Harrison," Victoria said, "we heard news about the ownership shift. We need a meeting today, preferably with you, your attorney, and your CFO." I glanced at Patricia. She nearly dropped her pen. David's face collapsed into full dread. 2 o'clock works," I said calmly. "My office." "We look forward to speaking with actual leadership," Victoria replied, and ended the call. The grenade had landed. The pin was gone. Now we just waited for the explosion. Kevin's voice cracked. "This is insanity." "No, Kevin," I said softly. "This is transparency, something this board hasn't practiced in years." I stood. "Patricia, you're coming with me. Bring all financial documentation on the Anderson manufacturing sale and NeuralSync acquisition. We're canceling both." She nodded instantly. Her allegiance had shifted. Smart woman. Kevin looked pale. David stared at the table like the wood grain might reveal a way out. But the real panic hadn't begun yet. That afternoon, we walked into Anderson Holdings. Victoria's office was all glass and steel. Minimalist, gleaming, expensive. She greeted me with a handshake that conveyed both power and warning. We sat. She didn't waste time. "Anderson family does not support chaos," she began, "and your board has delivered nothing but chaos since Richard's death." I nodded once. "Then you'll be pleased to know I intend to remove them." She raised a precise brow. "You're confident." "I'm prepared," I said. She gestured. "Walk me through your plan." So I did. Freezing all executive compensation, full audits, rebuilding operations, restoring transparency, protecting the divisions the board tried to cannibalize. Victoria listened, silent, expression unreadable. When I finished, she tapped the folder lightly. "You sound more like Richard than Samuel ever did." I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I whispered. Then Jennifer, my attorney, texted me. They're challenging the transfer in court tomorrow, claiming Richard wasn't mentally fit. I nearly laughed. Of course they were. I typed back, send the medical clearance and the Sudoku puzzle. Victoria watched my reaction with interest. Something wrong? No, I said, straightening. Something predictable. She smiled, sharp, approving, dangerous. Good. Predictable men are easy to defeat. She leaned back in her chair. If the documents hold in court, she said, Anderson Holdings will back you, and if not... Her smile darkened. We'll pull our 18% and short the stock on the way out. The room went quiet. Patricia inhaled sharply. Jennifer raised a brow, impressed. But me? I felt something slowly, beautifully settle into place. Power. Not the loud, performative kind Samuel loved. Not the fragile kind the board faked. This was earned power, the kind Richard had groomed me for, the kind no one could take away. By the time we left the meeting, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Tomorrow wouldn't just be a court hearing. It would be the day everything snapped into alignment. The day the liars fell. The day the underestimated woman became unavoidable. Tuesday morning arrived cold and sharp, the kind of weather that makes Chicago feel more like a warning than a city. I barely slept the night before, not because I doubted the documents, but because betrayal has a way of echoing in your bones long after the moment passes. Samuel hadn't come home. He texted once at 1:13 a.m. Don't wait up, with friends, need space. Friends meant people who only liked him when cameras were around. Space meant he couldn't handle anything that disrupted his image. I stared at the text longer than I should have. Not because I missed him, but because Richard once asked me quietly, almost apologetically, do you think Samuel will ever grow into the man this company needs? I had said yes then. Now I knew the truth. He never would. Cook County Circuit Court looked exactly the way justice should not look. Beige walls, flickering lights, and uncomfortable wooden benches that seemed designed to punish anyone who dared seek fairness. Jennifer sat beside me, calm and razor-focused. Patricia sat to my right, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Across the aisle sat David and Kevin, whispering frantically with their attorney, Richard Thornton, a man who looked like he billed by the eyebrow raise. Samuel wasn't there. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. He hadn't even asked what the hearing was about. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what his father had chosen. He simply didn't show up. And that absence settled into my chest like a slow, spreading bruise. The judge entered, Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair twisted into a bun that brooked no nonsense. She looked over her glasses instead of through them, a detail that somehow made her more intimidating. I liked her immediately. Thornton rose first, theatrics dripping from every syllable. Your Honor, he began, a grave injustice occurred. Our client, Mr. Richard Harrison, was manipulated in his final days. While undergoing chemotherapy and significant pain medication, he was coerced into signing away controlling interest to someone who... Someone who what? Judge Morrison cut in sharply. Finish the sentence. Thornton faltered. To someone unqualified. The judge raised one eyebrow. Unqualified to inherit shares legally transferred through proper channels? Interesting argument. Continue. David glared at me across the aisle. Kevin couldn't even meet my eyes. Then Jennifer stood. She didn't posture. She didn't dramatize. She simply dismantled them, piece by piece. Your Honor, she said, everything just presented is demonstrably false and insulting to Mr. Harrison's memory. She handed over the first document, a medical clearance from Richard's oncologist, signed the same day as the share transfer, confirming full mental competency, confirming no impairing medication. Then the second, notary testimony from Gladys Henderson, stating Richard understood every document he signed and discussed each clause in detail. Then the third, testimony from Richard's personal attorney, confirming explicit instructions, confirming deliberate intent, confirming Richard had planned the transfer for months. Then came the last one. Jennifer paused, lifted a single sheet of paper, and placed it gently before the judge. And finally, she said with perfect composure, an expert-level Sudoku puzzle Mr. Harrison completed the same afternoon, in under 8 minutes. Someone in the gallery laughed before choking it back. Even the court reporter coughed suspiciously. Judge Morrison squinted at it. Counsel, are you submitting a Sudoku puzzle as evidence of mental clarity? Yes, Your Honor, Jennifer replied. Expert level, perfect accuracy. If opposing counsel would like to attempt the same under similar conditions, she added sweetly, we can certainly arrange that. The gallery erupted. Muted coughs, stifled chuckles, even a muffled snort. Thornton's face turned a stunning shade of crimson. David sunk lower in his seat. Kevin covered his face with one trembling hand. Judge Morrison held up her palm. "I have reviewed the documentation," she said firmly. "The medical evidence is compelling. The legal procedures were followed meticulously. The witness testimony is consistent." She lifted the Sudoku puzzle next. "And frankly," she added dryly, "this is more convincing than half the expert testimony I hear in this courtroom." A ripple of laughter spread again. Then her expression hardened. "The share transfer is completely valid. It is upheld in full. Court dismissed." The gavel fell, and for a moment I felt nothing. No triumph, no victory, just emptiness. Because while they tried to erase Richard's decision, the person who mattered most, the one who should have stood beside me, chose not to show up at all. Outside the courthouse, wind whipped around us, cold and cutting. Patricia touched my arm lightly. "Jamie, you okay?" I nodded, though my throat was tight. "I'm fine, just tired." Jennifer squeezed my shoulder. "You won. He trusted you. That's what matters." But in that moment, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a woman who'd finally seen the truth. Richard believed in me, more than my own husband ever did. The board tried to destroy me. Samuel chose to abandon me. And the company, this giant, complicated machine of ambition and greed, now rested entirely on my shoulders. I inhaled deeply, then squared my spine. Dark moments don't last forever, but they do one thing very well. They reveal who you are. And I was done being underestimated. By 11 o'clock a.m. on Tuesday, I was back in the same conference room where they fired me just 4 days earlier, except this time I sat at the head of the table. Richard's chair, the one no one had dared touch since the funeral. The board filed in slowly, their expressions ranging from panic to denial to something like mourning. Not for Richard, for themselves. Kevin looked like he'd aged 10 years in a weekend. David's complexion hovered somewhere between gray and chalk. The others avoided eye contact the way children avoid teachers when homework wasn't done. Patricia took her seat beside me. Quiet, calm, steady. She had chosen a side, and it wasn't theirs. I allowed the silence to stretch, not cruelly, strategically. Richard once told me, "Executives fear silence more than failure. Let them sit in it." So I did. When I finally spoke, my voice was soft, even. "Let's begin." Kevin swallowed so loudly the whole room heard. I turned to him first. "Kevin," I said, "your resignation is effective immediately." He blinked. What? "You're no longer with the company. Please collect your belongings. And don't forget your mug." His eyes widened. The mug, the ridiculous, world's best executive mug he'd bought himself because no one else ever would. He looked at the table, at me, at Patricia, at the door. "You can't..." "Yes, I can," I said gently, "and I already have." He stood shakily, grabbed the mug with trembling fingers, and walked out without looking back. The door closed with a soft click. Silence again. Beautiful, cleansing silence. I turned to the rest of them. "And now," I said, folding my hands, "let's talk about your attempt to sell Anderson Manufacturing, Richard's oldest division, for 30% below market value." David stiffened. "We believed..." "No," I interrupted. "You exploited." I nodded to Patricia. She opened a thick binder, her analysis of the sale. Every lie, every discrepancy, every kickback-shaped shadow. I had never been prouder of her. She spoke for 10 uninterrupted minutes. Numbers, charts, emails, comparisons. Her voice steady, precise, formidable. When she finished, one director whispered, "My God." David tried to regain control. "You're overreacting," he insisted. "This is not how leadership works. You can't just fire people. You can't just cancel decisions." I leaned forward. "David, you no longer set the tone here. Richard trusted me with the company he built. Not Samuel, not you, not this board." He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the chance. "You think leadership is a stage, a spotlight, a title." I tapped the binder. "But leadership is this: understanding the business, protecting it, seeing it." His jaw tightened. "The decisions made over the last 2 months have jeopardized thousands of employees," I continued. "You treated Harrison Technologies like your personal ATM." One director shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down, ashamed. "And the worst part," I said quietly, "you assumed no one would stop you." I glanced at Patricia. "Operational audit begins today. Full authority granted to the CFO." Patricia straightened, a spark lighting in her eyes. "Executive bonuses," I continued, "are frozen until further notice." A murmur of shock spread across the table. "No exceptions," I added. Someone whispered, "You can't do that." I already have, I replied. By afternoon, the news had hit the press. Fired female executive revealed as 71% owner of Harrison Technologies. Corporate coup. Widow-in-law takes control after board ambush. Inside the takeover no one saw coming. CNBC requested a remote interview. I accepted. The anchor looked at me with that mix of curiosity and skepticism reserved for women who refuse to shrink. Some critics, she said, claim you manipulated a dying man into transferring shares. How do you respond? I smiled softly. My critics should read the court ruling, I said. Richard Harrison was of sound mind. He made a calculated decision to protect his company. If people want to call that manipulation, they're welcome to their opinion, but the law disagrees. Her eyebrows rose. And firing board members on your first day as CEO? Technically my fifth, I corrected, but who's counting? Kevin Parker tried to sell profitable divisions for personal gain. That's not leadership, that's looting. The clip went viral within an hour. Not because I was loud, not because I was dramatic, but because I was calm. Unshakably calm. And people aren't used to women being calm while dismantling an empire. That evening, Samuel finally called. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how the hearing went. He didn't ask why dozens of news outlets were emailing him for comment. He screamed, "Do you have any idea how you've humiliated me?" he shouted. "People are laughing. They're saying I fired my own wife who actually owned the company. Do you know what kind of joke that makes me?" I waited until he finished, then said softly, "You humiliated yourself, Samuel. You wanted the title without the responsibility. You wanted the image of power, not the work. That's not fair. It's the truth." Silence. Then he hung up. No apology, no accountability, no understanding. Just gone. And strangely, that felt like closure. Later that night, I stood in Richard's office, my office now, holding the same bottle of whiskey he once pulled from his drawer during our midnight strategy sessions. The room smelled like him, leather, cedar, quiet determination. I felt something shift inside me. Not hardness, not coldness, not arrogance. Alignment. For the first time since he died, I wasn't drowning. I was rising. The board underestimated me. The company dismissed me. My husband abandoned me. But Richard saw me. He chose me. And tonight, sitting in his chair, I chose myself too. Fallout always arrives in waves. The first wave is disbelief. The second is embarrassment. The third, the most devastating one, is consequences. By Wednesday morning, every person who had laughed behind my back, who had called me furniture, who had dismissed me as Samuel's decorative wife, was scrambling. And there is nothing more satisfying than watching powerful men panic. The Harrison lobby looked different that morning. It wasn't the marble floors or the high ceilings, it was the employees. They weren't pretending not to look at me anymore. They openly stared. Some with confusion, some with awe, some with recognition. Dave, the security guard who had always been kind, grinned wide when he saw me. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, practically glowing, "I knew they were lying about you. Knew it." "Thank you, Dave," I said warmly. "And it's Jamie, always Jamie." He nodded proudly, like he'd won a private bet with the universe. Marcus, the linebacker guard who escorted me the day before, straightened abruptly. "Ms. Harrison, good morning." Funny how respect arrives instantly once people know you can fire them. Upstairs, chaos reigned beautifully. Emails flew like confetti. Subject, urgent meeting. Board restructuring. Subject, legal inquiry. Immediate response required. Subject, termination processing. Subject, did you know she owned 71%? Kevin's office had been cleared out overnight. His mug was gone, his photos removed, his nameplate vanished. In its place sat a cardboard box the interns pretended not to snicker at. Gerald, the half-asleep director, had officially retired. His parting message? "Life's too short for David's nonsense. Good luck, Jamie." Honestly iconic. As for David, he wasn't doing well. He barged into my office without knocking, sweat on his brow, tie crooked. "Jamie," he said hoarsely, "we need to talk." "No," I replied, without looking up from Patricia's audit. "You need to listen." He froze. I may have been too hasty," he stammered. We can renegotiate, reevaluate, restructure. You tried to sell the company's oldest division for a kickback," I said flatly. "You jeopardized thousands of jobs." "I did what was necessary." "You did what was profitable," I corrected, "for yourself." His jaw clenched. "This isn't how leadership works," he hissed. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment." I lifted my gaze slowly. "David," I said calmly, "if I were emotional, you would be unemployed already. Instead, you're still here, sitting across from me, getting a chance to explain why you deserve to keep your position at all." Sweat beaded at his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it, because even he knew he didn't deserve it. "Meeting at 2, I said. "Prepare your justification." He fled. The door clicked behind him like a timid apology. The second wave hit at noon. Bloomberg released an article titled, "The woman they fired last Friday now owns the company." The comments were brutal. "This is better than TV. Imagine firing your CEO and then finding out she owns you. Kevin Parker should invest in disappearing. Justice for the quiet women in corporate America." By 1 p.m., Jamie Harrison was trending. Not for fashion, not for gossip, for competence. Richard would have laughed until he cried. Then came the third wave, the personal one. Samuel texted again. "We need to talk, tonight." I didn't respond. He called. I let it ring. He called again. Ignored. Finally, he showed up at the office, breathless, messy, wearing a distressed sweater that he probably thought looked artistic. "Jamie," he said, barging into my office, "why aren't you answering?" I looked up from Richard's old desk, calm, still, stronger than the girl he used to scold for taking work too seriously. "I've been busy," I said. "Busy?" He laughed incredulously. "You took over the entire company. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying I didn't know anything, that I fired my own wife like an idiot." "You did fire your own wife like an idiot," I said simply. "Accidentally firing the majority owner doesn't make you a victim, Samuel. It makes you careless." His face reddened, but he took a step closer. "We can fix this. We can fix us." "There is no us in leadership," I replied, "and there hasn't been an us in a long time." He stiffened. "This isn't fair," he whispered. "Neither was being abandoned when I needed you most." His eyes widened. For the first time in months, he looked at me, really looked at me. But it was too late. "I'm not angry anymore," I said softly. "I'm done." He swallowed hard. "Jamie, please." I shook my head. "You wanted the title, the spotlight, the legacy. But you didn't want the work. You didn't want the truth. And you certainly didn't want me once I stopped being convenient." He exhaled shakily, realization dawning. And it hurt him. Not losing me, losing the narrative. He left without another word. The door closed. And I felt nothing but release. That same evening, the final wave hit, the one Richard warned me about. The moment when the people who created the lie stumble over the truth and fall flat on it. Because at 5 p.m., Victoria Martinez sent a message. "Looking forward to our first joint board presentation and to working with leadership that actually understands Harrison's value." Underneath was a direct note to me. "Richard was right about you. Don't let anyone make you smaller." I closed my eyes. For the first time since he died, the grief didn't suffocate me. It held me, steady, warm, proud. The people who underestimated me were losing everything they clung to. Reputation, power, influence. And I hadn't lifted a single vindictive finger. All I did was stand in the truth Richard left behind. Fallout doesn't destroy the innocent, only the guilty. In the weeks that followed, Harrison Technologies didn't become perfect. Companies don't transform overnight. People don't either. But the chaos settled. The lies stopped echoing through the hallways. And for the first time in years, the company felt like it was breathing again. I spent long nights in Richard's study, now my office, surrounded by his old ledgers, his notes scribbled in the margins, his stubborn red pen markings correcting sloppy numbers. I could hear his voice in my mind. "You don't fix a company by shouting, you fix it by seeing it." So I learned to see everything. I listened to factory managers the board never bothered to meet. I adjusted supply chains the directors didn't understand. I restructured divisions based on performance, not politics. And I promoted people who had been invisible for far too long. The employees, the real backbone of the company, began to trust me. Not because I was loud, not because I was ruthless, but because I was steady. Every day felt like stitching together a legacy he'd handed me with shaking hands. Samuel moved out 2 weeks after the takeover. He packed quietly. No dramatic speeches, no pleading. Just a man gathering the last pieces of a life he'd taken for granted. He left his key on the kitchen counter. For a long moment after the door closed, I stood there, not knowing whether to cry, laugh, or simply breathe. In the end, I chose to breathe, because letting go is not a failure, it's an opening. One evening, as I watched the city lights pulse like a living constellation outside my office window, Patricia knocked softly before entering. "The audit is complete," she said. "We can rebuild this, properly." I smiled, genuine, grateful. "Thank you, truly." She hesitated. "Jamie, most people wouldn't have survived what you just went through." I looked back at the skyline. I didn't survive it, I said quietly. I became someone else through it. Someone stronger, clearer, unshakably grounded in who she was. The underestimated woman was gone. The woman Richard believed in, the one he trusted with everything he built, had finally stepped into the light. On the day we announced the new restructuring plan, I visited Richard's old study again. The whiskey he left me, my 30th birthday gift, waited on the shelf, untouched all these years. I poured a glass and lifted it toward the empty chair he once occupied. To new beginnings, I whispered. To every woman who was ever told she was furniture. To every quiet voice mistaken for weakness. To every legacy built not on ego, but on integrity. The amber liquid caught the glow of the sunset, and I knew, deep in my bones, that this wasn't just his victory. It was mine, and it was only the beginning. Lesson for the viewer: sometimes life doesn't break you, it reveals you. Sometimes the betrayal you fear becomes the turning point you needed. And sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who hand you the opportunity to rise higher than they ever imagined. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to be loud to change your life. You don't have to be ruthless to win. You only have to know who you are and refuse to shrink. Because the world underestimates quiet women. Until the day they don't.